I just say I noted that there's quite a few people here who haven't got very much mineral planning experience, which is great. This is very much an introductory session on mineral planning. The RTPI South East and RTPI London of the last few years have run a couple of courses on waste planning and minerals planning for non-mineral planners, and it's really aimed at raising awareness of the topic, because it does seem to be a topic that is often overlooked, and in particular, unless you're working within a mineral planning authority or waste planning authority, it's perhaps one of those things which is out of mind, but it's an important element of planning, which needs to be everyone ought to have an awareness of, at least. As Jeffrey said, I lecture to students on the planning schools at Brighton University and Kent University, and I do lectures on minerals and waste planning. And I'm sad to say I think they're one of the few courses that do cover mineral and waste planning. So hopefully this morning we can help fill that gap. So next slide, Jeffrey. So a basic introduction. First question, I suppose, is what are minerals? So what are we talking about when we refer to minerals? So essentially, minerals are the raw materials that we use in just about every single product that we use, all the goods we have, and the homes, the schools, the hospitals, the infrastructure that we utilise on a daily basis. If it wasn't for the extraction and processing of minerals and their use, we just wouldn't be able to enjoy the quality of life that we can. So I've just picked out a few key ones, bearing in mind that this is a session for this RTPI South East, but there are some a lot of these minerals are extracted from across the country. So aggregates are the main mineral type, and within aggregates there are several different types of aggregate. So we've got sand and gravel. Within sand and gravel we have sharp sand and gravel, which is used for concreting, and then we have soft sand, which is used in mortar. Also there's crushed rock, which is frequently limestone, which is also used in concreting. And then recycled and secondary aggregates are playing a greater and greater role. And the other thing to say about aggregates as well is that, especially in the southeast, we are seeing more and more sourced from marine extraction, which are landed to wharves in the ports across the southeast. So also important minerals, brick clay, as the name suggests, it's used in the manufacture of bricks and tiles. Silica sand, we have particular high quality silica sand resources in the southeast, which are used in glass manufacture in the north, and also in chemicals. Building stone, this is a more of a niche, I think, mineral which is used to help restore and preserve historic buildings. Gypsum, in the southeast we have one of the largest gypsum mines in Europe, and that's used mainly for plasterboard. So that's a British gypsum operation in East Sussex. And other key minerals are chalk and limestone, used in the manufacture of cement. But there's others that I've listed there, which are known as minerals of local and national importance, all of which are used, have various important uses. Next slide. So in terms of how do we know where they are? Well, the British Geological Survey produces maps for each mineral planning authority, and this shows the geology in the ground and sets out where we can find mineral. So this particular map shows is just an example. It shows you West Sussex, and the various different mineral types that can be exploited, and where they exist. I think one of the things I'll just point out quickly is the location of the soft sand resource, which is the pinky orange color running through the middle in a fine line, because that actually is consistent with the South Downs National Park, an area of outstanding natural beauty. So there are particular issues with its utilisation. Next slide. So what activities are involved in mineral supply? Probably the most obvious one is quarrying, so simply extracting the mineral from the holes in the ground, and also similarly open cast mining. Then we have mining itself, and I mentioned the British Gypsum mine. That's a picture of it on the top right hand corner. Interestingly, also located in the High Weald area of outstanding natural beauty. We have drilling, in particular for hydrocarbons. There's the storage of minerals, processing. So we will process minerals to turn them into useful products. So through crushing or screening, we have concreting plants, asphalting plants, mortar manufacture, and transport is a key activity associated with mineral production. Most of the minerals are not evenly distributed, and so have to be transported around the country to where they can be used. Next slide. And this slide briefly shows movements of minerals. I know David will talk a little bit more about this, but basically it's trying to illustrate the point that minerals transport is a particularly important activity. And utilisation of water and rail is an important aspect. It's a bulk material which does lend itself to rail and water transport. Next slide. So the characteristics of mineral working, key one is that it can only be worked where they occur. So unlike other forms of development where we have choices where we can put housing and industry and retail, minerals, we have fewer choices, and we have to work with what we've got in terms of the geology. So there are adverse environmental effects. I mean, that is without question, but there are ways in which they can be mitigated by careful design of facilities, and Helen's going to talk a little bit more about that. It's important to bear in mind that in terms of quarrying, it's a temporary use. Ultimately, a quarry will come to the end of its life, and it will be restored, although it can be a couple of generations before that happens. The land, as I said, can be restored. Monitoring takes place over a number of years, and the minerals planning authorities, which are the county authorities, national park authorities, unitary authorities, regulate the planning of mineral supply. The other point to bear in mind is the fact that district and borough councils have a very important role to play in safeguarding. So I'll explain a little bit more about safeguarding, and so will David. I think and finally, I think the thing is that there is frequently opposition to quarrying. It's large-scale activity, often in the countryside, so it's frequently an unwelcome activity. It becomes controversial and so can be political, but it makes it challenging, and in turn, as a planner, that makes it an particularly interesting activity area of planning. Next slide. So key considerations: where the mineral is, so what the economic geology of an area is, trying to understand where it is and what can be extracted in what locations. The fact that it's a finite resource, ultimately it will be all used up. For mineral planners, it's about securing an adequate and steady supply, ensuring that we meet the demands for mineral, while at the same time balancing those with the impacts associated with that activity. Safeguarding, I mentioned safeguarding. This is really ensuring that future development doesn't hinder the extraction of mineral in the future. So we safeguard mineral resources by ensuring that development takes place in a way that doesn't sterilize the mineral resource. Inevitably, there's local amenity issues to consider, such as noise and dust. Landscape is a key issue. It does seem that many of our most important minerals are located near to national parks, an area of outstanding natural beauty. Jeffrey's moving me on quickly, quite right too. So moving on to minerals local plans, these are key issues that need to be addressed. What the contribution the mineral can make to national and local requirements. Local aggregates assessments are a means in which we do that for aggregates, and David will talk more about that. How are they going to be provided? Where are they going to be provided? Taking into account the existing operations, existing mineral resources, and impacts of the developments on the local environments and communities. Next slide. So just a final slide. I wanted to draw particular attention to the change in the real change in the source of aggregate in the southeast, as we're finding it harder and harder to find land-won sources of aggregate. More and more of our aggregate is being sourced from marine licensed areas, and being in the southeast, we have plenty of those, and the mineral comes into various ports around the southeast. But the important point there is that they need to be safeguarded. So we need to make sure that those wharves, which can also perhaps lend themselves to attractive places to build homes, are safeguarded and their operations can continue. And that's becoming an increasingly important issue. Next slide. So that's it. Just a warm up really for David and Helen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. It is a very comprehensive introduction on minerals planning, and I think I just have a very reminder that for those of you who are just attending that webinar or attending, have any burning questions, just use your chat function, because we will come across all those questions in our Q&A sections at the end of this webinar. Right, so now we move on to our next speaker, David Payne. David has a degree in biology, ecology, and a master's in urban and regional planning. He is also a chartered member of RTPI. David is a senior planning advisor to the Minerals Products Association, responsible for making representations, development plans, and advising on national planning and environmental issues. He is also a secretary of the CBI Minerals Group, which recently produced the UK Minerals Strategy. David also worked as a planning consultant for Sisbury Consulting and BPP Consulting. Previously, he was planning manager for the South East England Regional Assembly and also worked for the Environment Agency and RSPB. So today, David will focus on a few important things you need to know and remember. Several points. Minerals are essential to the economy and our way of life. Distribution is uneven. Construction aggregates are the largest material flow. Safeguarding of mineral resources in the ground and of minerals infrastructure. Recycle aggregate contribute for the supply of this country. And the last but not least is a temporary basis of minerals extraction. So I now move on to David. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. As Jeffrey said, I work for the NPA, which is the trade association for the minerals industry, the main one. And that's non-energy minerals, which brings together about 95% of the sector. CBI Minerals Group, who I also represent, brings together a few other trade associations and some energy minerals. So cover pretty much the whole sector from those two groups. I've only got 10 minutes and it's an introduction to minerals planning. So I tried to focus on 6 things that you ought to know and to remember. There's obviously many more than that, but given the time, we'll try and get through 6. Next slide, please, Jeffrey. So the first one is the essentiality of minerals. Next slide, please, Jeffrey. So just some context. this is drawn from various reports the NPA and the CBI Minerals Group has produced. The main headline, I guess, is 390 million tonnes per year of minerals and mineral products. If you, next slide, please, Jeffrey. The vast majority, as Ian already mentioned, of that supply in terms of tonnage is construction aggregates. So the stuff that goes into construction, a lot of it goes into concrete, but there's also other things that goes into a mortar. But that's the largest flow. And it's around, if you look at minerals products and minerals themselves, mineral extraction, it's about 1 million tonnes a day, every day of the year, being moved around the country, extracted and moved around the country. So it's a big amount of material. It's the biggest movement in the economy. Next slide, please. And this just shows you historic trends in production, so sales in GB, Great Britain. You can see that it fluctuates depending on the economy. You can see the impact of the 2008-2009 recession with a drop in construction activity. It also reflects the different mixture, which has remained reasonably constant between crushed rock, which is the bottom green bars, sand and gravel, the middle yellow bar, and then recycled and secondaries. And of the sand and gravel supply, as Ian mentioned, about 20% of that is for marine dredge sources. So particularly important in the South East. There's around about 4 million tonnes a year landed in the South East. And in London, sorry, around 6 million tonnes in the South East. In London, 4 million tonnes. And in London, that represents almost half of the consumption of aggregate in the city. Next slide, please. It's not just construction. You can see this flow chart, which on the left shows the different sources of material, the different types of mineral, and in a very simplistic way, but quite important in terms of visuals, the ranges of uses that they go into. So a lot of it goes into construction, but there's also a lot of material that goes in to serve various industries and products. And on the right, it's just an example of the amount of material that it goes into various construction projects. Next slide, please. So Ian touched on this. Distribution is very important. Obviously, it's geology, and so you can only extract the material where it exists naturally, primary materials. So on the left, you have the distribution of sand and gravel with some of the main sites for extraction highlighted in the dots. On the right, a different distribution of the main crushed rock resources, which tend to be in the west, so particularly in Somerset, but also the north and the Midlands. So particularly from the southeast and London perspective, a lot of material moves, a lot of rock is imported from the southwest and also from the East Midlands, particularly Leicestershire, into southeastern London, which has very few rock resources, as you can see. Next slide, please. So some examples of what it looks like. If you go back a sec, Jeffrey, just tab backwards. This is a soft sand site down in Hampshire, so it's used primarily for mortar, so for bricklaying. You can see that the characteristic is quite shallow. This is a very good natural resource which requires very little processing from the ground. Next slide, please. This is a typical sand and gravel quarry. This one's in Oxfordshire. Again, reasonably shallow. It's in a river valley. Very small amount of overburden, so the resource is just below the surface. This site in particular is going to be restored to a very large nature reserve, one of the largest reed beds in the country when it's restored in about 20 years' time. This site is a rock site up in Shropshire. The stone here is very important for road stones. It's very skid resistant. There was the Bahrain Grand Prix yesterday, which had that crash, obviously. The rock that surfaces the Bahrain Grand Prix circuit is from this site in Shropshire, incredibly. Next slide, please, just to show that it's not only locally important, some of this material is globally important. This is a limestone quarry with a cement works, so feeding the cement works. And next slide, please. And this is China clay works down in Cornwall, so quite extensive working to extract the China clay. I think what we can actually see in the foreground there is aggregate processing, which is a kind of secondary activity on top of the China clay. China clay, again, a globally important resource, goes into a lot of ceramics, a lot of paper around the world. Any toilet you've ever sat on, the China clay probably came from there. And this is marine dredged, coming into a dredger, so it's hoovered off the seabed pretty much. And I'll say a bit more about that in a second. Just so you've got you can visualize the impacts and the scale of some of these operations. Okay, focusing on aggregates and the managed aggregate supply system, I'll explain what this is, because this is the main flow of material. It's the main type of material that planning generally, particularly in the Southeast, has to consider. Next slide, please. So I think Ian showed this slide. Reflecting the distribution, the managed aggregate supply system is supposed to secure a steady and adequate supply of material and address regional geographic imbalances between where the material exists and where it's required, so between the supply and the demand. This diagram just shows some of the main movements of material. So on the left, you have crushed rock movements, which, given the limited distribution in the North, Midlands and the Southwest, a lot of it goes into the main markets in London and the Southeast. A lot of that by rail, so the long distance movements are by rail. There's a lot of infrastructure investment on the production sites with railheads. Materials then moved. A lot of it moves by lorry too, but a lot of it moves by rail into the areas of demand. On the right, you've got sand and gravel movements, which, because it's more widely distributed, they tend to be much smaller, around 30-mile movement maximum of material from a quarry, and much more local supply, because it's heavy, dense material, quite low value. It's not economic to transport it a long distance. Although what those two blue arrows show coming into the Thames and the South Coast show the major contribution of marine dredged to London and the Southeast too, which I'll talk about a bit more in a sec. Next slide, please. So the managed aggregate supply system, prior to 2010 and localism, the abolition of regions, we had a kind of top-down system of national and regional guidelines which set out national forecasts of demand to enable a steady and adequate supply of material, under which you had regional apportionments, which then were distributed to the county councils or the upper-tier authorities to provide in their plans. Under localism, that's gone. The guidelines ran out this year. There's no national forecasting. It's all down to local aggregates assessments. So they are the fundamental component of aggregates planning at the moment. They're based on the forecast of the average of 10 years sales. So they're quite backwards looking, particularly if you consider the graph I showed you earlier of the impact of the recession. So you look at an average of 10 years sales as the starting point for forward planning for the amount you may need over the next 15 years of a planned period. They're supposed to look at all supply options and also capacity of those sites to supply. And I think the important point here is land banks. One of the fundamental principles of the managed aggregate supply system is that you maintain minimum land banks, as in permitted reserves of material which are permitted for extraction through the planning system. The minimum are a 7-year land bank for sand and gravel and 10 years for rock, which really reflects the time it takes from identifying sites, going through the planning process and then getting production from them. It can take a long time, so you need a land bank of material to enable steady and adequate supply. And also the balance between demand and supply. Next slide, please. Now, the MPA with the Planning Officer Society, we produce guidance on producing good quality local aggregates assessments, because there is guidance in PPG. There's mention in the NPPF what an LAA should do. This really reflects emerging practice. So I've put a reference there if you're interested in having a look at that. Next slide, please. The MAS system, in the absence of regional planning, is administered by the aggregates working parties. These are regional groups which bring together all of the mineral planning authorities plus the industry. Their main function is to ensure that the region as a whole and the planning authorities together are providing an adequate supply locally, but also nationally, to address those regional imbalances in material. They're a bit hamstrung at the moment because of the lack of guidelines. There's a lack of benchmarking against which to consider whether they are producing enough and planning for enough. There is supposed to be a national coordination of all of this through a thing called the National Coordinating Group. Used to be chaired by the ministry, so CLG. It's met once in the last 10 years, so it needs revitalising. The system is on its knees, but hopefully noises being made by CLG are more positive than they have been for the last 10 years. So we're hopeful. Just a diagram here just to show it's a bit clumsy, but it just shows the central position in the managed aggregate supply system of local aggregates assessments. They inform what the plan provides for. That then goes through to identification of suitable sites, which includes site allocations and also preferred areas for investment and planning applications to come forward, maintenance of land banks, ultimately leading to planning permissions and production, then monitored back into local agriculture assessment. Next slide, please. So, given the movements of material around the country, the movements are from railheads into rail depots or from marine dredged into aggregates wharves. You need to safeguard the important infrastructure for transport, but you also need to safeguard the material in the ground, which is a long-term aim, long-term policy. It's not just about the amount of material you're going to need for the planned period. It's protecting finite resources for future generations. And the first one is about land one minerals, identification where those resources are in the ground, and avoiding unnecessary sterilisation through permitting development on top of them. So a very important point for district councils, permitting and planning for housing and commercial development, to consider minerals in the ground, mineral safeguarding areas and mineral consultation areas as part of that planning process, which again, historically has been a bit of a problem that it's not been considered in the local planning process because it's seen as mineral planning, but actually it's the local planning process which is critical to consider where the minerals are. Next slide, please. Again, the MPA and the POS has produced and the information requirements that are required, the consultation process, particularly between district councils and the county council as the planning authority in two-tier areas, to ensure that minerals safeguarding and safeguarding of infrastructure is taken into account at very early stages of site allocations, distribution development and planning applications. An important point here, I think, is the concept of the agent of change, which is in the NPPF, which is about ensuring that existing businesses are not adversely affected by new development. Some examples here, there's a map of mineral safeguarding areas. So where the resources are, this is in Kent, where the resources are in the ground, which need to be considered when planning applications are coming forward or when you're considering allocations for development. On the right is a rail depot. You can see new flats built right next to it with balconies overlooking it. So there's a lot of potential there for conflict between, particularly for noise and also dust. Jeffrey, if you can tab back a second, just one or two. These are, yep, go on, forward now. Go forward and forward again. This is Greenwich Wharves on the Greenwich Peninsula, where about 3 million tonnes a year of material comes in by dredgers from marine dredge sources and gets unloaded here. You can see it's an area where there's lots of high density, high value development right next to the wharves. And so one of the big issues in London, and particularly around the Greenwich area, where it's one of the main areas in the whole country for import of material. You've got potential conflict between noise. The barges can only come in when the tide's right. There's noise in terms of the engines of the barges, the discharge of the material and the process of the material. And so you have to build in mitigation to new development to avoid the noise affecting the residents, which is where that's the agent of change, which first really appeared in the London plan and now is embedded in the National Planning Policy Framework. Next slide. And the next one. Thank you. So just to focus on London and the South East, in London, 97% of its primary aggregate supply, in terms of the amount of material that's consumed in London, the primary material that's consumed in London comes from outside London. So a lot of it comes by rail, as I say, from the East Midlands and from the Southwest into rail depots, and a lot comes into those wharves. Next slide. And these are the licensed areas off the Southeast and off the East of England. These are licensed areas where marine dredging occurs and it comes into those wharves in the Thames. And there's nearly 9 million tonnes a year comes into those wharves. When it comes into Greenwich, it then gets distributed by rail, a lot of it, but also by road. Next slide. And into rail depots. So for example, Acton, it then gets distributed around the capital and also outside the capital by rail. So these are just the numbers in terms of which, again, in London, people aren't aware of this, the amount of material that is required to maintain the construction activity and the economy and where it comes from. Most of it comes in through rail depots, wharves, which is why safeguarding is so important. Next slide. Okay, recycling and secondary supply. Next slide. This is what it looks like. This is some quite high-tech kits which recycles construction demolition waste into recycled aggregate and sorts it into sizes and quality. Next slide. Overall, this is a trend in the production of recycled aggregates in GB. You can see it's plateauing at around the 30% mark, which suggests to us that we've kind of reached pretty much the limits in terms of how much material can, as a proportion of overall supply, can be met through recycled material. Most of that is, as you can see from the graph, it's around 30%. Most of that is recycled aggregates. There's a small contribution from secondary materials. Next slide, please. And it's 30%. It's about the best in Europe in terms of percentage of overall supply. Of course, that supply depends on the construction material being there in the first place, which depends on construction activity. It also depends on that being the hard fraction of material which is able to be recycled, and also the quality of the processing plant and the kit to extract that material. The NPA has produced a couple of reports recently on this. On the left, it shows the total waste stream, which is one of the largest waste streams in the economy, is construction, demolition, and excavation waste. 120 million tons, that's the figure that was cited in the recent construction sector deal, which highlighted it was the biggest waste stream. But actually, when you look at where that material goes, the vast majority of it is used constructively, either through recovery, so for landscaping and filling of voids, or into recycling. And in fact, 90% of the hard fraction of construction waste already goes into recycling. So again, it suggests that it's not an endless supply. We've probably reached the limits in terms of the amount of material, particularly the hard fraction, that can be turned back into recycled aggregate. It's not all suitable for all uses, particularly for structural concrete. You still need primary aggregates. So it's not an answer to replacing primary material. We're going to continue to need primary material. But NPPF does say before you consider primary material, you've got to look at the practicability of supply from recycled material. So it's an important thing in terms of planning, but don't be under an illusion that you can replace primary production with recycled production. Next slide, please. I'll provide some references. So finally, mineral extraction is a temporary use. Once the extraction has occurred, which might be for a sand and gravel site, maybe 10 or 20 years. This is China clay, which has been worked for centuries, but they're now reclaiming some of the spoil tips. Next slide, please. This is a sand and gravel site down in Devon. This is your typical, so that's restored back to heathland. It probably was heathland when it was permitted 50 odd years ago, which probably wouldn't happen these days, but the restoration is now delivering really good biodiversity and good landscape. Next slide. This is more typical sand and gravel extraction, generally in a river valley, where restoration to a mosaic of wetlands is typical and delivering. It was probably intensive agriculture, probably improved grassland before it was developed. There's now a mixture of wetland habitats. Next slide, please. And again, even on crushed rock sites, which are much more difficult because they can last for decades, there's often quite a lot of landscaping and biodiversity work around the edges of the sites, particularly on landscaping bunds, but much bigger challenge in terms of restoration of very, very deep holes over decades. Next slide, please. And the NPA has just produced its new biodiversity strategy, which we commit to delivering net gain wherever possible, which is coming through the Environment Bill anyway, but also set out the measures that we take to work with various partners to ensure that sites deliver the best they can. Just a couple of graphs here quickly. Next slide, please, Jeffrey. We've audited what member companies have done over the years in terms of creation of habitats on restored sites, UK priority habitats. So it's not all wetlands, although wetlands takes up about 20% of the overall sites. You can see a lot of woodland creation and also a lot of meadows and grassland. So over 8,000 hectares already created on sites. Next slide, please. We've also looked at what's committed to in restoration plans. And again, this was all before biodiversity net gain was a concept or a requirement. So again, over 11,000 hectares, which is only a snapshot of some of the main companies. You can see a range of habitats being created or planned to be created. I think the change there is the big change in the reed bed, the orange segment of that pie, reflecting difficulty of creating open water and some of the opposition to open water in the future. And so members looking at other ways of creating different wetland habitats, which are going to be very important for biodiversity. Next slide, please. So on biodiversity net gain, it's coming through the Environment Bill. It's likely to be a legal requirement for all development in 2023, with a metric that DEFRA has produced, which will be launched again, the new one launched before Christmas, which sets out the methodology you can apply to sites to demonstrate that you're delivering biodiversity net gain. Just an example here of the kind of potential for minerals to deliver biodiversity net gain. We've done a lot in terms of creation of habitats, but what we've not been very good at is measuring the net positive of that. So that's what we're going to have to do in the future. This is some work done by Cranfield and Tarmac, looking at a range of sites and what was there before and applying the metric and what was there after. So you can see, your typical development of a sand and gravel quarry, it may well be intensive agriculture, very few features. Okay, there's some hedgerows, but it's generally a wildlife desert. Before development, post-development, you can deliver a mosaic of wetlands and deliver a very substantial biodiversity net gain. Next slide, please. So just to recap, Jeffrey mentioned these in the beginning of my slide, my presentation anyway. 6 things to remember: minerals are essential. Go on, Jeffrey. You can only work them where they occur. They're different to other types of development. The largest material flow is primarily aggregates going into construction, which is managed through the Managed Aggregate Supply System, which is the basis for minerals planning in the South East. Safeguarding is very important to safeguard the stuff in the ground for future generations, but also safeguarding the infrastructure to enable the stuff to move around. Recycling is important, delivers about 30% of supply, but can't completely replace primary production. And minerals development is essentially temporary. But overall, next slide, please. It's important as planners to recognise supply can't be assumed, which is an issue, I think, like the white paper, the planning white paper, no mention of minerals, no mention of minerals planning, even though this is the material which underpins all of the housing and development, which delivers our quality of life. So can't be assumed. You need to plan, monitor and manage, and we need to make the link between delivery of development and mineral supply. Just put the final slide up there, the UK Minerals Strategy. We produced this 2 years ago through CBI Minerals Group and MPA, which pulls together a lot of the things I've spoken about today. So if you want to go, a simple place to go to get all of that, have a look at the UK Minerals Strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. It is a very good presentation and covering, I think, most of the topics in the minerals planning. We now move on to Helen Hudson. Helen is the Chartered Town Planner and has some 30 years of planning experience, both in local government and in the private sector, dealing with development plan, policy, and planning applications. Helen worked as Surrey County Council for 16 years, covering a wide range of planning issues, including the Surrey Structure Plan, Countryside Strategy, County Council planning applications, strategic and environmental impact assessment, minerals and waste local plans, and minerals and waste planning applications. In 2006, Helen then moved to Alliance Planning and gained experience in planning consultancy. In 2010, Helen set up her own consultancy, Hudson Planning Limited, and is now an independent planning consultant working predominantly on mineral waste projects. Today, Helen will talk about minerals planning applications, including the types of minerals applications, something about pre-submission work, and how to prepare a minerals development planning applications. Now I pass it to Helen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. As Jeffrey said, I'm an independent planning consultant that's worked with large mineral companies on both aggregate and hydrocarbon applications. Today, I'm going to give you a very brief introduction into making a minerals planning application. Luckily, Ian and David have covered a lot of the detail about minerals, so I'm just going to skip through the surface of having an application, as you may not realise how much work has already gone into an application before it reaches your desk. Next slide, please. So in the short time I have, can you just go back a slide? Sorry. So in the short time I have, I'm going to outline the different types of minerals planning application you may see. Some of the pre-submission work which goes into a mineral site before the application can even start to be drafted, and then finally tell you about the work that goes into preparing an application ready for submission. Next slide. So firstly, I'm going to tell you about the types of minerals application that you may become involved with as a minerals planner. Firstly, any minerals application will be different depending on the type of mineral you're preparing an application for. For example, hydrocarbon, oil and gas applications are often broken down into exploration, appraisal and production individual applications, whereas applications for minerals such as sand and gravel and clay will be all-encompassing and include extraction and production within the same application. But the applications will always be prepared in full and are not outline applications. Next slide, please. Secondly, applications will differ depending on whether you're dealing with a new quarry or an existing site. Applications for a new site to work a new reserve will be located on a greenfield site that probably has no infrastructure, may have no access or haul road, and so will require a huge amount of project planning, design and assessment to get an application in a suitable state for submission. Next slide, please. Applications for an extension site may be simpler in terms of assessment and setup work because the access, processing plant and haul road may already be there, but often they can be complicated because the extension site may have knock-on impacts on the other approved planning permissions for the existing quarry, as you may end up making 2 or 3 applications to secure changes. And the slide here shows this is the case for a recent application for an extension I prepared at Hamer Warren Quarry in Hampshire, where I had to prepare 3 applications and also have an overarching EIA. Next slide, please. Other applications for minerals development may be associated with upgrading the existing processing plant or equipment on site, or maybe a Section 73 variation application. Next slide, please. And some applications involve the review and update of mineral planning permissions, in particular their conditions that were granted after the 30th of June 1948. And this was made a requirement by the 1995 Environment Act. These applications may need to be supported by EIA as well. Review applications should happen every 15 years, but this frequently has been relaxed now under the Growth and Infrastructure Act of 2013, which enables site operators to request a deferment where there's been no material change in the circumstances of the quarry. Next slide, please. Or development may be permitted development, so it's not a planning application for permission as such, but the council still may require you to prepare an application for a certificate of lawfulness of proposed use or development. Next slide, please. Oh, that's fine, sorry. So now I'm going to quickly focus and run through preparing a planning application for a new mineral site. And before an application can even start to be prepared, there needs to be a lot of work that go on in terms of trying to find a suitable site. As already said, minerals can only be worked where they're found. So companies will use existing borehole and geological data to pinpoint potential mineral sites. And for hydrocarbon sites, they'll use seismic surveys. Hydrocarbon sites have some flexibility over their location, but generally still needs to be within a certain distance of the drilling trajectory, so they can get the drilling trajectory on target. Once they think they have a potential mineral site, they'll ask their mineral planner will then undertake a planning appraisal to see what environmental and amenity constraints are and whether suitable access can be achieved. If this initial planning appraisal indicates that the site looks suitable, then further boreholes will need to be dug to test the quality and amount of deposit. The mineral company will then need to assess whether the mineral resource is in a usable location, is it close to existing markets, where there's demand, will it be worth the investment in the land and the processing plant and the planning application? And even if they have the correct site in terms of impact and market, the operator will need to do a deal and get an agreement with the landowner and whoever has the rights to work the minerals. Once this has all been worked out, Only then can they decide to go ahead with preparing an application. But they may want to get the site allocated in the local minerals plan first. Next slide, please. Usually a minerals company prefers to have a site allocated in the local minerals plan before preparing an application, because the company wants certainty before investing in an application and securing capital expenditure on a project. Sometimes applications are submitted without allocation if the company has been watching the land bank and the local aggregate assessment and believes they can make a strong case based on need to secure planning permission. On other occasions where an application may be prepared without allocation, or if there's a major infrastructure project which is going to need huge amounts of material like HS2, or where a large housing allocation or development threatens sterilisation of a mineral deposit. Next slide, please. So you have your site and it may be allocated. Next, you can start preparing the planning application. So what's involved in these key steps? Next slide, please. In preparing an application, initially it's a good idea to take part in some sort of pre-application engagement with the local planning authority. This can either be through an EIA screening or scoping request, which usually minerals applications end up needing EIA. But as an applicant, the mineral company may also opt for pre-application advice from the local planning authority or statutory consultees, especially if it includes a site visit or meeting, as this provides them with the opportunity to explain to them the method of working and propose mitigation measures. And it also gives them the opportunity to discover any local issues that they may not have identified in the site appraisal work. Next slide, please. So, how's the site going to be set out? What's the method of extracting the mineral? And what's the restoration of the site going to be like? These are all key considerations in designing your planning application. Next slide, please. Aggregate minerals are usually worked in a series of phases, and often if there is a processing plant and sometimes a concrete plant also on site. Working in phases means that the whole site is not an open quarry void, but rather minerals extracted from one phase, and then whilst this first phase is being filled and restored, extraction work progresses onto the second phase. How this phasing is arranged, where the extraction margin is planned, where the processing plant is erected, and where all of the stripped soils are stored, all needs to be planned and designed, and will depend on the characteristics of the mineral, the site, the environmental and community constraints. And ultimately, you as a mineral planner need to secure planning permission for the operating company. So you have to be involved in the design of the site to make sure it meets the environmental and community policy guidance set out in the NPPF and those of the relevant development plan policies. And I've just put some questions on the screen, and these are just an example of many questions which need to be answered so that you can come up with a plausible site setup and extraction scheme. Next slide, please. And the other consideration has been spoken about already, is how will the site be restored? Mineral development is temporary and usually on a greenfield site. Thinking about the restoration scheme at the beginning of site design leads to a better and more successful planning application. And there are many after uses that a mineral site can be restored to. For some sites are a combination of the uses that are shown on this slide. Restoration to nature conservation with net biodiversity gain means you may want to retain and enhance particular habitats and features already on site, and design the mineral extraction around them. And restoration to housing may mean working with the house builder on the design of the mineral scheme. Next slide, please. So once you have a plan of how the quarry or hydrocarbon site will be worked and restored, various baseline assessments will need to be undertaken to understand what impact the proposal will have on them and what mitigation measures will be required to reduce them to acceptable levels. And this slide lists some of the possible assessments that may need to be undertaken in support of an application and included in the EIA. Next slide, please. And once these assessments are undertaken, the design of the operations may need to change and mitigation measures introduced or altered. So the final design development scheme will be a bit of an iterative process to ensure that the proposal stands the best chance of securing planning permission. And this slide lists some of the mitigation measures that can be built into the minerals scheme. So I'm not going to do the list that I'm showing on the screen, but hopefully you'll get the slides at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. Also, as has been spoken about, minerals isn't popular, so pre-submission community engagement is a key part of any minerals application. And it's also helpful, if you do get planning permission, to have a local minerals liaison group to keep communications open whilst the site is operating. Next slide, please. So once you have your development scheme, your assessments, and have engaged with the community and minerals planning authority, you are then ready to submit your application. The application is submitted to the minerals planning authority, which may be the county council, a unitary council, or a national park authority. This and the next slide show the typical application documents, plans, and content which make up a minerals planning application. In terms of plans, the method of working, phasing plans, and the restoration plans are probably the key differences from those submitted with a housing or retail application. And the planning statement submission should include a section on need for the mineral, which should set out the status of the land bank and whether annual mineral production requirements are being met in the area. The application will also need to focus on the restoration scheme and the benefits it will bring once restored. Once the application is validated, minerals is classified as a major development, so there'll be a 13-week period of determination, or 16 weeks or more if it's the IA. A minerals application then follows the more normal regulation and procedure of how a planning application is assessed. So this has been a bit of a whirlwind, but as you can see, I've tried to outline to you today there's a huge amount of work that goes into preparing a minerals planning application before it arrives on your desk. It can take years to find a site, to get it allocated and prepare the application. And I haven't been able to cover all of the items or unfortunately go into any examples today. But I hope you got a flavour of what it's like to prepare a mineral application. And it can be really an interesting process. And you're really the project manager working with a team of consultants and the Minerals Planning Authority to deliver the minerals to the market, which we all need and use. So I think as the others have mentioned, I encourage you to get involved in minerals planning during your career, and you may be surprised how challenging but enjoyable it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. I think because we see the time is already nearly 12. We got a bit of 10 minutes extension for the Q&A section. So I'm now putting all the speakers back now. We now just jump to the Q&A section to skip the time. So I already got a couple of questions in a panel box. Probably I start with the question in a very basic question regarding minerals planning. There's a question regarding on minerals resources are limited, and see whether they want to know about how much is there left and when will they run out. And also there's a question regarding on is there any key legislations regarding on minerals planning apart from NPPF. I possibly put that question first to Ian. Maybe you take round and then Dave and Helen. Yeah.
Right, just going off mute. Well, I mean, in terms of resources running out, I mean, there are a lot of resources in the ground. It's just a question of getting to them and trying to find suitable locations, you know, where they can be developed. And you know, as we find it becomes harder and harder to find, you know, those bland agricultural fields that can be easily extracted, perhaps. We're just having to become more innovative in our approaches. Your question about the NPPF, Jeffrey?
I think the question is regarding on apart from NPPF, is there any other legislation or other guidance regarding on minerals planning?
There's the planning practice guidance. So as well as the NPPF, there's the planning practice guidance, which is yes, also essential reading for a minerals planner, I'd say. And you know, David and Helen may also have some thoughts on that.
I think it's just worth looking at some county council websites, looking at their minerals plan, going through those, and also they have guidance on for applicants on how to put together an application. So I think Hampshire's got some information on that. So it might be worth going and look at their website.
And in terms of quality of resources available and reserves permitted, all of the mineral planning authorities are supposed to produce the local aggregates assessment every year. So they set out, as well as setting out forecast demand, they all identify what the situation is in terms of reserves, quality of resources, availability of resources. In quite a few areas now, the available resources are being depleted. So they're not all able to provide through their plan period or provide a suitable land bank, to be honest, in a lot of areas. But the LEA is the document which sets out the geology, the background, the constraints and the opportunities. So they do provide quite a good overview of the situation in each of the mineral planning authority areas.
Okay, thank you. I think I move on to other topic. I think there's a lot of question regarding on secondary recycled aggregates. I think regarding on what types of secondary of recycled aggregates are. I mean, can the speakers give a bit of overview of the recycled materials in an example on how they are produced? I possibly start that discussion maybe Dave first, because Dave possibly a bit more things in, possibly to Helen and Ian. Any comments want to add?
Yeah, so it's a whole range of material. If you think about when buildings are demolished, the type of material that gets mixed up in that demolition and then provided to it's not necessarily a mineral operator it goes to, of course, it may go to a whole range of waste operators. So a lot of it's going to be concrete, there's going to be bricks. So concrete is obviously made of primary aggregates generally, and can be crushed. So you see concrete crushers on a lot of recycling aggregate sites, but also other sorting infrastructure, which sorts out the different fractions of the material in terms of size and also quality. But it depends on what's in the mix that's coming from the demolition sites. The other side of it was the excavation waste, which is generally soils and clay, which doesn't go back into aggregates because it's by its nature it's not going to be suitable as construction material. So I think in terms of supply for construction, it's the hard fraction, particularly the recycled concrete, is going to be the valuable material that's coming through.
Anything from Helen, Ian? No, I move on to other section.
As David said, I think traditionally it's kind of managed by the waste sector, but more and increasingly, I think it's making an appearance on mineral sites where the recycled aggregate can be blended with primary aggregates to make them go further. So that's the kind of change that's happening in the recycled aggregate area at the moment.
Ian,
Jeffrey, yeah, sorry, I was just going to mention the fact that the government, I think it was only last week, the government, as part of its circular economy and work on circular economy, has just announced funding. I think it's for University College of London to set up a centre dedicated at looking at, improving the rates at which materials can be recycled and reused. So, yeah, it's definitely on the agenda.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Well, I think time is running out, so I think try to skip the question. I possibly move on to another quite popular. It's about the green economy. There's a question regarding on whether taken aggregate from the sea, was there any requirement for the biodiversity netting? Any environmental impact regarding on compare with when extracting from marine aggregates compared to land-based? And also, is there any international case study or any requirement of minerals extraction in this country? So possibly Ian first maybe, and then Dave, and then Helen. You want to say something to add?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of mineral marine extraction, I mean, that can only take place in licensed areas, so it's strictly regulated. And there are zones now, you know, essentially marine parks, which are dedicated protected areas, you know, marine zones. We now have those. I mean, we didn't have those sort of maybe 10 years ago, but there is particular zoning of the seabed which is intended to protect and enhance biodiversity. So there is protection going on. It's you know, it's not as though the entire seabed is being vacuumed up, as it were. So
yeah, there is environmental impact assessment for licenses are given. As Ian said, there's obviously a marine planning system now administered by the MMO, Marine Management Organisation, which identifies areas which are suitable for different uses, which includes aggregates extraction. In terms of net gain, the biodiversity metric doesn't apply to marine. There is a seabed users group which brings together not just marine aggregates, but also power generation, particularly offshore wind farms and oil and gas and other interests, which are liaising with Natural England and DEFRA at the moment about how to apply net gain to the marine environment. Obviously, it's more difficult in marine in terms of what's there to begin with being surveyed properly and what would you deliver in terms of a net gain. It's not necessarily, it's very different to the terrestrial side. So there isn't a requirement for net gain in marine, but you know, there may well be coming down the line. And it's what I think there's going to be debate about what's tradable between marine and terrestrial as well, potentially, in terms of delivering on intertidal, because the net gain metric does apply to intertidal habitats, but it's yeah, it's not the same and would be difficult to implement, I think, net gain in marine.
Helen?
I'm not really able to add that much more, other than I think it would be, I don't think any studies have been done, I think it would be very interesting to compare the impact of marine versus the impact of land one, in terms of transport and environmental impact on the seabed, etc. So that was
yeah, I think the other
someone to do.
Yeah, the other thing to say there, Helen, of course, is particularly in London, you know, you've got that large tonnage being delivered right into the wharves in the centre of London. There's only about 300,000 tonnes of aggregate extracted within the boundaries of Greater London per year. You've got 4 million tonnes of marine coming into Greenwich and Dagenham. So it's delivered closer to point of use and avoids road miles, as well as you've got the similar amount of crushed rock coming in by rail, also delivered quite close to point of use and then transferred on by rail. So in terms of overall environmental impact and impact on the areas in which it supplies, it's generally a beneficial thing.
Okay, I think I got the last question, because I think time is running out. Regarding on white paper, safeguarding materials, minerals things possibly quite important. Any views on the government new approach to zoning? Whether any views on safeguarding? Is there any conflicting or any views on that one? Yeah,
so the MPA, CPI, POS, lots of organisations made the point that, I mean, well, the pros and cons of the three zones by the by, but identifying the growth areas which are where there will be deemed permission for housing, you've got to also consider mineral safeguarding in that as one of the constraints that you have to consider alongside all the other types of constraints that you have to consider before you enable development. Otherwise, you override the planning system and protection of the environment, protection of communities. So again, we raised it in our response. I know others did too, because it just completely ignored the presence of, as well as the point I made about ignoring where the material comes from in the first place. Yeah, it completely ignored mineral safeguarding. And in the renewal areas, again, the pressure that you might then put on infrastructure, which is noisy, operates 24 hours a day, generates noise, visual impact, dust potentially. The impact on sensitive residential receptors is a key thing. So you've got to consider that. And I think the whole zoning, CLG say it's not saying it's areas, but the whole of that approach just overrides normal planning procedures, which I think is just, it's never going to happen, is it? So let's not get too hot under the collar.
I think that's Ian, Helen.
I just get a flippant remark about perhaps if we'd had this session 12 months ago, government wouldn't have forgotten about minerals. I mean, it's just classic. You know, the whole point of this seminar is about raising the awareness of minerals planning. And I think the fact that it's not in the white paper just demonstrates how forgotten it is. So hopefully this morning we've been able to, you know, do a little bit to set that right.
Do you think that? Not then. Oh, maybe I end up that section in this. I mean, at this point, then. I mean, on behalf of the RTPI South East, I would like to say thank you to all our speakers, and I believe that this webinar will give you an introduction to those who are not familiar with minerals planning. I think it's also a great opportunity for those who are working in minerals planning to refresh and get a new insight of minerals planning. Just a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and will be available on the RTPI YouTube channel. So please feel free to share with your friends and colleagues who cannot attend. There will also an email sent to you after the invited to get some feedback of today's webinar. The last but not least, thank you for attending. I hope that we will see you on our next event.